Last week, COP28, the 28th annual UN Conference on Climate Change, came to a close. This conference is where nations come together to draft international agreements to fight climate change. The agreement produced at the end of this year's conference is a major point of debate. Some people are praising it as historic in the fight against climate change, while others denounce it as a sham. So, what did the agreement say, and why is it so controversial? This year's agreement set the goal for the world to triple renewable energy production by 2030 and double energy efficiency in the same time frame. However, the most important part of the agreement calls for transitioning away from fossil fuels and energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner, and to achieve net zero by 2050. This is the first time an agreement at one of these conferences has called on nations to transition away from fossil fuels. In the past, agreements have aimed to reduce emissions and phase down fossil fuels. Finally, there's an international agreement that says we need to stop using fossil fuels, but this isn't nearly enough. So, what's missing from the final agreement? While the resolution is a step in the right direction, it lacks urgency. We need to move away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible to reduce the impacts of climate change. It also has loopholes that leave room for harmful transition fuels like natural gas and biomass. Natural gas is extracted through harmful practices such as fracking, and it emits the greenhouse gas methane when burned, so it's no better for climate change than coal or oil. Biomass, which is when organic material is burned, causes harmful air pollution and requires heavy deforestation. We must move to energy sources that are actually clean and renewable instead of propping up false solutions. Another loophole in the final agreement allows for carbon capture, a false solution that distracts us from transitioning to renewables and will only waste time and money. I have a video about why carbon capture is a false solution, so go watch that one after this if you want to learn more. Anyway, the agreement reached at COP28 might have been perfect 30 years ago when we still had plenty of time to shift away from fossil fuels before climate change got too bad, but we've waited way too long to agree to the bare minimum. This year was the hottest year in an estimated 125,000 years, and unless we stop climate change, things will only get worse. It's appalling that we've waited this long to take significant action. It's appalling that it took 28 climate change conferences for countries to agree to eventually stop using the things that are causing climate change. It's all appalling, but it's where we are, so we must keep fighting for a quicker and more just transition away from fossil fuels. This raises another question. Is the agreement just and equitable as it claims? At the end of the day, this agreement still leaves people behind. It lets innocent people die while the countries and companies that cause this problem get to keep making the problem worse and keep making money. After all, there's no enforcement or strict timeline in this agreement, so everyone can keep burning fossil fuels as long as they stop at some point. Here's a not so fun fact that perfectly exemplifies this. When the final agreement at the conference was gavelled, meaning it couldn't be changed anymore, some small island nations weren't even in the room. These nations are some of the places most threatened by climate change, and throughout the entire conference they fought hard to keep the language of the agreement from getting even weaker. This means that they lost a chance to fight for stronger language. These countries need a strong agreement or they will literally disappear. If this example doesn't highlight the truth of what these conferences actually are, I don't know what will. Diminishing the voices of some countries is clearly harmful, but it's not the only reason there was a weak final agreement. So, what is the main reason for the weak agreement, and why has it taken so long for these conferences to get around to saying we should stop using fossil fuels? Many people blame the conference host, the United Arab Emirates, for the lack of commitments to climate action beyond vague, surface-level promises. And that makes sense, as the UAE's economy depends heavily on the extraction and export of fossil fuels, so they're not likely to support the end of global fossil fuel usage. In fact, they hosted the conference in Dubai, a city built with oil money. They also got to choose the COP president, who leads the negotiations at the conference. They appointed Sultan Al Jaber, the head of the UAE's state-owned oil company. This is a wild conflict of interest. The CEO of an oil company should be nowhere near climate negotiations, since we need to phase out oil to stop climate change. Additionally, days prior to the start of the conference, reporters uncovered the UAE's plans to strike oil and gas deals with other nations during the conference. Things didn't get better after the conference started. Early on, Al-Jaber said there is no science behind the demands for the phase-out of fossil fuels, and that doing so would take us back into the caves. This contradicts all of the climate science from the past 40 years, as well as the UN's official position on climate change, but it's not a surprising statement given that it's coming from an oil man. Having oil people in charge of the conference also meant that absurd amounts of oil lobbyists could attend negotiations. Yes, you heard that right. Oil lobbyists got to attend the conference whose end goal was to get countries to stop using oil. There have been oil lobbyists at the past few conferences, but this year the number quadrupled to an astounding 2,456 people. This means that there were more oil lobbyists than delegates from all but 2 countries, and the lobbyists outnumbered delegates from the 10 most climate vulnerable countries combined. They also outnumbered indigenous representatives 7-1. Additionally, there were 340 agribusiness lobbyists, a large share of which were from the meat and dairy industry. It's not surprising that the agreements made at this conference were so shallow when you realize that the groups that need to be regulated have some of the largest seats at the table. So, how was this allowed to happen? Is it odd to have a petrostate in charge of a COP? While COP28 was astoundingly oil-centric, the UAE is not solely responsible for the conference's downfalls. The host countries of these conferences almost always end up being a villain of some sort. 2 years ago, COP26 in the UK was criticized as the most exclusionary climate summit ever because of the horrible organization of the event, the lack of accommodations for people with disabilities, and the minuscule number of delegates from the global south. Last year, Egypt was the host of COP27, and in the lead up to the conference, they were detaining climate activists and cracking down on protests. Next year won't be much better, since the host will be Azerbaijan, another petrostate with a poor track record on human rights. So, while the UAE is absolutely at fault for many of the problems with this year's conference, there are larger structural issues at play. One of these many structural issues has to do with what happens next. What happens when countries don't meet their targets? The final resolution that countries agree to at the end of the COP isn't binding. There's no punishment for failing to meet the targets. For example, only a few nations are currently on track to cut their emissions by the amount required to keep global emissions below 1.5 degrees Celsius, the goal set at the Paris Climate Accords in 2015. And even if these negotiations were binding, they're usually so weak that they fail to accomplish anything anyway. Large oil-producing nations like Russia and Saudi Arabia are usually blamed for trying to weaken climate negotiations so much that they don't accomplish anything. But they're not alone. Many nations in the global north, especially the United States, work hard to weaken climate language. Their goal is to make it seem like they're doing something to fight climate change while keeping the agreement from actually compelling them to action. For example, at this conference, Saudi Arabia was rightfully vilified for leading a group of oil-producing nations to reject language on moving away from fossil fuels. The US was a key player in stopping this from succeeding, and it pushed for language calling for an eventual end to fossil fuel use in the final text. That being said, they sidestepped supporting the stronger claims that we badly need. If the US had been a strong advocate for a full phase-out of fossil fuels instead of pushing for weaker language like phasing out unabated fossil fuels or transitioning away, phrases which leave loopholes for carbon capture, transition fuels, and short-term oil expansion, they could have gotten most of the world behind them and had language that was at least a little bit stronger than what ended up in the final agreement. So, if these conferences are such disappointments, what's the point of having them? Well, firstly, other UN conferences on the environment often accomplish a lot. Every year, there are a bunch of conferences with topics ranging from biodiversity protection to plastic pollution, and these are often successful. The reason the climate change ones fail is because there is so much fossil fuel money tied up in politics, so many countries are unwilling to challenge fossil fuels. That being said, it's still important to get countries together to negotiate. Remember, countries still have to do the work themselves to reduce emissions, so these conferences can set the guidelines for how to do so. And while most countries will not meet their promises, others may go above and beyond, in part thanks to the goals set at these conferences. Secondly, important things can happen at the conference that aren't in the final agreement. For example, on the first day of the conference, countries ironed out a loss and damage fund. Basically, at last year's conference, nations agreed that developed nations should create a pile of money that developing nations can use to prepare for the impacts of climate change. A loss and damage fund is badly needed, and at the beginning of this conference, wealthy nations pledged a combined $700 million to the fund. This is great in theory, but some estimates concluded that this will cover less than 0.2% of the money needed. This is horrible. Rich nations built their wealth through heavy usage of fossil fuels, and they're not willing to pay for the damages that it has caused. The United States, which has emitted more greenhouse gas emissions than any other nation, pledged only $17.5 million. This is a shamefully low sum. That being said, If we didn't have these conferences where countries got together to negotiate stuff like this, that number would be a lot closer to zero. Progress is absurdly slow with these conferences, but at least there's some progress. Finally, one of the biggest benefits of the agreements that come out of these conferences is that activists can use them to hold politicians accountable. For example, there's a fight in the US right now to stop the build-out of liquefied natural gas export terminals, which will make climate change worse, increase local air pollution, raise the cost of natural gas for Americans, and strengthen the power of the fossil fuel industry. All of these are great arguments against the proposed terminals, but now activists can also argue that building these export terminals is not transitioning away from fossil fuels and energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. While politicians aren't exactly known for keeping their promises, we can still try to hold them accountable. So, at the end of the day, the outcome of COP28 doesn't do much, and I doubt that the hordes of oil lobbyists that attended the conference are disappointed by the outcome. Nevertheless, the final agreement is better than what many people, including myself, thought it would be, and it can still have some beneficial impacts. It's up to us to hold politicians accountable. Climate action at the local, state, and federal levels are still where most of the progress is made. So let's all get involved in making change there. There are tons of environmental groups doing great work across the country, so I highly recommend getting involved with a group near you. Thanks for watching, and make sure you keep learning about climate change and speaking up for our future.